You're listening to Real Folk with me, Jo Burke. Welcome aboard, and you'll know why I've said that very soon, dear listener. It's Real Folk, and this week I am delighted to say I've got with me Dan Parks, who is a DOP. We'll explain what that means for those that don't know, and also, most recently and most excitingly, an author. So welcome aboard. As I said, that's a huge clue as to why you're aboard. I'll say it again. Ahoy, Captain Dan Parks.
Ahoy. Thank you for having me on the show. It's great.
You're very, very welcome. Dan and I'm just trying to think when we first met working on an indie film with the brilliant Andy Elias, a good few years ago now, called The Numbers, which is available on, I think, is it Amazon? It's on Netflix, one of those things.
Yeah, but we did something before that. Don't you remember the...
Did we? What did we do before that?
You know, the biscuits. What was it about the end of the world?
Yes, we did. That sketch. I love that sketch. Yes. I forgot about that. Was that before the film? It was,
It was. I'm pretty sure it was.
It was. Yes. You can see all these things on the U of the Tube. I think it's on Netflix. The Numbers is the film. And yeah, the film was about biscuits. You're right. Yeah. The end of the world. Sounds weird, but it was very funny and very good. Yes. And it looked marvelous because, as I said in the intro, Dan is an amazing DOP, which is a director of photography and cameraman extraordinaire. What does, just for people that don't sort of know what a DOP does, could you explain?
I like how in the United States they use the term cinematographer. And, you know, that sounds so much flasher. But, basically it's all about playing with light and cameras and lenses and shooting. In fact, my very first word as a baby was apparently light. You know, not mama, dada, or whatever. It was light.
Wow.
Because I've been fascinated by light. I remember there's a famous DOP called Jack Cardiff, and he said that being a DOP is painting with light. And that's always resonated with me. So I like, you know, if you look at the grandmasters, you know, in the painting world, you can see how they use light to sculpture the face, to create 3D out of 2D. And I think that's what, as filmmakers, we try to do.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful way of putting it, isn't it? Painting with light. That's amazing. That is what you do. I was just looking at your show reel as well. You've done more or less everything: music, videos, promos, interviews, and most excitingly, drone stuff as well. I love the old drones.
I qualified as a drone pilot, so I've taken the professional route, not one of these guys that flies drones around airports and things. It opens up a new world. I always think that you can make anything that looks quite drab look beautiful when it's an aerial shot. Somehow from above it looks better. So I've shot some quite sort of drab places that somehow the drones kind of lifted them. But you know, it's a fantastic tool to have in the toolbox.
Yeah, and like you say, I think everything does look better from an aerial view. It's just the sweepingness of it, isn't it? It's just beautiful.
The opening to The Numbers, which you referred to, has this sort of grand drone shot over Seven Sisters, which is near where I live. It meant taking the drone a mile off coast. It's probably more than a mile off coast to then fly it back in, and it's this beautiful opening shot. The only thing is we shot it, and it was beautiful sunshine, unlike most days in England. And then Andrew Elias, you know, the director, said, I want it to look like it's raining and overcast and gloomy. We had to add all these visual effects to make it look like England normally looks like.
That's hilarious. The typical, isn't it? England, for the one day that it isn't pouring, raining cats and dogs, that Andrew decides that he would like it like that on a beautiful sunny day. But it does look really, really impressive. So you're called a pilot of one of those. I find that quite hilarious because I think of you being sort of shrunken down and inside it when you say that. But I suppose you are a pilot, aren't you?
Well, you're flying it. Yeah, you're definitely flying it, but remotely. I mean, it's... I actually got taught by a 747 pilot. I felt really quite secure, actually, you know, learning how to fly a drone professionally by someone who flies something much larger than a drone. And so it's all about safety, isn't it? You know, just learning safe ways of doing it. And I think it's that disciplined approach which is really important. And as a filmmaker, I go back to, you know, I started filming on film. And that's also a disciplined approach, which, I'm not trying to knock other people who haven't taken that approach, but, you know, you do get people who just fly a drone and just keep it rolling, keep it recording, and you get all these very long shots which aren't particularly interesting. But if you combine knowing how to fly it safely with a DOP's eye, then you can get hopefully some good shots.
Some beautiful moments, yeah. So, how long have you been a cameraman, stroke DOP, and what did you? You said your first word was light as a kid. So, did you immediately just always were you focused on doing this as a job?
Yeah, I've always been interested. I can remember when I was only like 7, 8 years old, wanting to make a film, and this is during the 80s when video wasn't really a thing, and you could only shoot on film 8 mil. And I remember going to this is in New Zealand, the chemist as we called them, and working out how much it would cost to buy these reels of film to make the film that I had this idea for, and just realizing it was going to take too many years of pocket money, just way too expensive. But then late 80s, this concept of video came along, VHS and tapes, and that's when I really got into filmmaking because I realized it was more accessible. So my very early films were shot on tape, and I'd literally edit by just copying from one machine to another and learning the principles of editing that way. I was filming some sort of, family holidays and sort of basic things like that, but it was giving me all those skills. But it was when I got married and my wife said to me, what do you really want to do? And at the time I was working in a daily newspaper as a graphic designer. And she said, really want to do? And I was like, well, one, I want to go home. I want to go back to England. England's home to me. And two, I want to be a filmmaker. And in 2005, I was accepted into Brighton Film School. The dream began.
Wow. Oh, that's amazing. So you were in Australia for some time?
New Zealand and Australia.
New Zealand
Most New Zealanders have lived in Australia. I think there's probably more New Zealanders in Australia than New Zealand sometimes. But I've lived in both countries.
And were you born here in the UK or were you born in New Zealand?
No, I was born in a what I call a Commonwealth outpost of Christchurch, New Zealand, to British parents who had been part of that great exodus during the 50s and 60s to Australasia to try to find something, a new world to kind of
wasn't it?
better
Didn't
their
some of
lives.
them was that the ones that they were called £1 poms or something where
Or 10 quid tourists,
yes,
slightly more expensive.
Wow, amazing! It's amazing though, isn't it, to think?
Well, they went to we're getting quite sidetracked here, but it is an interesting story actually. They went to Australia independently. The families didn't know each other. They went to one was Sydney, one was Brisbane, and they both absolutely hated it. It was too hot. There's lots of insects. The culture's completely different. So they both heard that New Zealand was a little bit more like England. The weather's a bit gloomy, it's a bit colder, there's not so many insects. And they both ended up in Christchurch, which is arguably the most English city outside of England. I mean, it's a very English city, garden. It's a garden city. It's known as a garden city. And that's where they met. And then I've just taken it full circle and come home.
Come home, yeah. Oh, that's so sweet. So do you get out there much now?
I mean, sadly, and actually this in a way leads us on to the book, but I've had to return to New Zealand quite frequently because my mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And that's never it's the worst cancer you can get, essentially.
Yeah.
There's actually a little side point on this one. Eric Idle, the comedian from Monty Python, once went to the doctor to ask what's the quickest way to die. And he was told by his doctor pancreatic cancer. Once you get it, that's it. You're gone, basically. Later on in life, he got pancreatic cancer, and he sees the funny side to that. The irony of it. But when my mother, discovered that's what she had, I found that article, and I kind of thought, should I send her this article? I'm not sure if I should. There was that funny side to which he discovered. I mean, he actually battled it and overcame it. But my mother, she tried so hard. She tried absolutely everything. But what it meant is that I was traveling a lot. It's a 30-hour flight. You stop along the way, but altogether it's about 30 hours. I was thinking I want to take my mind off things a little, and I don't like watching loads of films on a plane. I don't know about you, but after the third film on a plane, you're like, oh, God, do I have to watch another film? This is as a filmmaker,
Yeah.
It kind of gets too much. And so I've found in my job that the best way to overcome time on a plane is reading a book. Time just flies. You just get lost in a book, and before you know it, you're there, and you're kind of disappointed. You're like, oh, I was really getting into that. So, so I decided to do the same, to read and to do research, and my one of my hobbies since of quite a young age has been the Titanic, reading about it, researching it. And hence, that's what I got into. I was reading, writing, researching on the plane, traveling to New Zealand. And this is where the book came from, because I sort of chanced upon something which I hadn't heard about before.
So let's, dear listener, you're wondering probably, what book is it? What book is it? It's called
Titanic Legacy.
It's The Captain, the Daughter, and the Spy. Is that right?
Yeah, I really struggled to find the right name for this book because it's about three people: the captain, the daughter, and the spy. And I originally wanted to call the book the Titanic Captain's Daughter. Well, the phrase "the captain's daughter" somehow has a nice sort of ring, but it's only like a third of the book, and I felt it would be an unfairness to the other two characters because their stories. In a way, she's more like a narrator. I struggled to find the right term, and I thought really it is this legacy. Like if your family's involved in a disaster of that scope, it's obviously going to have its effect, and it did. I mean, she lost her father, the captain,
Yeah.
and but by the age of 49, she had lost her mother, her husband, and her two twin children.
Oh my
And
goodness.
it was and this is what you would probably find. That information is probably what you would find in the sort of postscript footnote of a biography of Captain Smith. His
Yeah.
daughter had a life of tragedy, and I knew this, and I'd been writing an online biography of Captain Smith, and I was aware of it, but I kind of thought it seems a bit unfair to her. We don't know anything else. Well, I mean, what about her? What about the details of exactly what happened? Did it really happen? Because there's a lot of mythology
Yes, tons around it.
associated with there's this, and I've got other websites that debunk conspiracy theories about the Titanic and things of that nature. So I was kind of interested in getting to the facts of what really happened, and along the way I then suddenly discovered that her husband, this is the captain's daughter, her name's Mel, or Melville, but it was shortened to Mel, that her husband, she married this very wealthy stockbroker in the 1920s, and then he mysteriously dies of a gunshot wound to his stomach in 1930. Now, I think anyone hearing or reading that will just make the assumption that this is obviously something to do with the stock market. In the 1930s, the 1929 crash. If it was headline news at the time in England that this very famous wealthy sportsman, stockbroker, author, shot through the stomach. I think assumptions at the time were it was suicide. The inquest ultimately ruled accidental, but that was it. But then I started discovering more articles about him, and the one that he had quite a long duration affair with a very famous Cambridge professor of economics known as John Maynard Keynes. Everyone knows about Keynes economics. I sort of found out that, he was bisexual, he had this affair, and he maintained that relationship even after getting married. I found evidence that they were still in contact. I'd never heard that before. And then, as I was delving a little bit further, I then found out that he had worked for MI5. And that even after marriage, that the house that they were living in Temple, London, was being used by MI5 as a safe house. There's all these kind of elements that obviously you need to read the book to know more
Yes,
about.
definitely. I can't wait.
But suddenly this death in 1930 takes on a little bit more because there are far more factors at play. In fact, the stockbroker fact, I think, is almost
A red
not
herring.
relevant. Yeah, it's a red herring because he was a very wealthy man. He hadn't lost. In fact, I also found there's this thing where a lot of people think that people were jumping out of windows and what have you in 1929, 1930. In actual fact, suicides of that nature weren't particularly common, especially in London. So there were a lot of assumptions being made at the time, and I think one of the things I haven't been able to do with the book is reopen the case, which I'd love to do, but I've done everything else I could possibly do in tracing what happened with newspaper reports and very interesting things like diaries. I've been able to uncover, for example, Keynes. He actually dined with. I should give him a name, by the way. I haven't even given him this MI5 spy's name, but Sidney Russell Cook was his name. And Sydney and Keynes, they had dinner the night before he died.
Oh.
So there were a lot of things I suddenly discovered that I don't think were ever brought out at the inquest. I mean, the inquest certainly didn't bring out the fact that the house was an MI5 safe house. There was a telegram I discovered that was sent requesting a revolver, but another MI5 operative in the Temple area was in need of a revolver. I don't know why, but he needed one, and the address he was given to get one.
Was their address?
So there's things like that. I mean, he was a hunting man, Sydney, so he was known to have guns. He liked to hunt. So, in fact, the maid who discovered his body during one of the interviews mentioned how there's always a gun over the door, and there's things like that came out. So there were guns around, but I don't know about if anyone ever were aware of the MI5 connection. The fact that he had been involved basically a year before he got married. He'd been involved in a failed Russian operation because during the 1920s, early 1920s, the rise of the Bolsheviks and what have you, there was this concern that basically England was being infiltrated by Russians. Not too dissimilar to what's happening now.
Yeah.
But there was a concern that they were wanting to basically maintain control or get control of the newspapers, particularly. The connection is that Sydney Russell Cook, he'd fought during the war, but got injured and then was moved into the intelligence department because of being injured. He had a Cambridge background, and there's a known connection between Cambridge and Cambridge spies.
Yeah.
But then his sister married someone who became an MI5 director. So that's where I found the connection. And in the early 20s, Sydney was involved in this operation to basically, trace potential Russian, those with Russian interests in England at the time. But his cover was blown quite quickly. He clearly wasn't a very good spy. I found a diary extract that actually shows the moment when his cover was blown. And it's fascinating. And I assumed at the time that that's when he gave up being MI5's not for me. And he got into the stockbroking world, and he became a co-author of books on economics and things of that nature. But along the line, I've discovered, as I said before, that his house was still being used by MI5. He was still maintaining those connections. So I think these all play into this mysterious death in 1930.
So he was found at home then with the gunshot wound.
Yes, by the maid.
Yeah.
Like 8 o'clock in the morning, she went to find. I think he had orangeade as his drink of choice first thing in the morning, and she went to take it to him and found him on the floor. And actually it's the start of my book. I detail exactly what happened at that moment where she screams, runs out, and the first person she can find is a postman. But a shocking sight for a young maid to discover.
So that's interesting. So the book that's called Titanic Legacy starts with the last person mentioned in it. So it starts with the spy, basically.
Yes, although the spy section is actually the middle section because well, one of the things, and it's quite an important thing to note, is that in amongst all of this tragedy, you've got this woman, the captain's only daughter, Mel, who goes through that. She loses her husband, and like a year later, her mother was hit by a taxi. The captain's widow was hit by a taxi. She was partially blind in one eye, and it was raining, and she was trying to hold an umbrella up and went across the road, and it was a low speed collision. But she was 70 at the time.
Right.
That happened just a year after this mysterious death of her husband. And then she had twins, and they both died very early 20s. Her son Simon died during the war as an RAF pilot, which again, there's some irony to this, is that he crashed into the sea, and so he was, technically that hope for the lineage to continue, but he ended up in the sea like his grandfather. His twin sister, a few years later, 1947, died of polio. And this was just shortly before all the polio vaccines and things were coming out. So she lost her two children, her hope for the future. And yet, and this is the third part of the book, the daughter section, is that she went on to become quite an amazing woman. She didn't let that tragedy define her. She became quite empowered, I guess, to some degree. She became known as being... Well, she became a pilot during the 1930s.
Wow,
which was quite amazing. Yeah,
yes.
One of the things that I really loved about researching this book was those discoveries that you make. And I'd heard that she was a pilot, but you kind of think, okay, during the 1930s, a lot of women who were showing interest in flying planes here, there, and everywhere, and oh, maybe she had a go one day, kind of thing. But then I was looking through an article, and I just suddenly discovered this picture of her standing with her plane, the one she owns. To me, it just suddenly, it's like, yeah, she wasn't just a pilot, she was a pilot. She was known for driving fast cars. She was known for being incredibly hospitable. She kind of ended up living in a small village of Leafield in Oxfordshire. The reputation that she got, like students from Oxford who were living locally, she would look after them, almost take them as her own children, the ones that she had lost. She made up for it by being hospitable to others that she saw that didn't have their own parents there or whatever. I got to meet a woman who's now in her 90s who remembers her, and there was a lot of that coming through, the way that the tragedy didn't embitter her.
No.
And it kind of resonated with me because at the time I was dealing with my mum. It went from her fighting and then she lost the battle. Hence the book is dedicated to her. And also another friend who I happened to lose just before her, who also died, a Titanic friend. So the book is dedicated to them. The thought that, in the face of adversity or tragedy, that you can find hope.
Yeah, I think it's that thing, isn't it? It's an age-old expression that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but it is so true. And you've got two choices when you lose people, and no one escapes this life without losing close people. It either sort of spurs you on to do more stuff with your own life, or you can just be really sad and depressed about it. So I think the majority of us, especially creatives, I think it always seems to be sort of a pivotal moment where you then go and do the next thing, because you go, right, okay, time is short, I've got stuff that I want to do, and I want to leave a mark and leave some stuff behind for people. So that's
Yeah, I mean, you're
amazing.
right. I mean, on that point exactly is the two friends, Brian and Tina. Brian was a Titanic friend, very close to me, who I really wanted to tell him about the book and all the stuff I was discovering. But I thought, you know what? It's a surprise. I'll tell you once I've got it all sorted. And then he died, and he never got to find out. And my
Oh,
mother, I knew she didn't have much long. She probably had a month or so to go. So I flew out to New Zealand and said, look, here's the book. I
yeah,
mean, at that point, it was a manuscript, on my laptop. Even at that point, I wasn't sure it was going to get published. Although in the end, I approached four publishers and they all went, yeah, we want it.
that's
So I had to
amazing.
kind of, yeah, I didn't expect that. But one of the things I was so pleased about, and again, it sort of goes back to learning lessons, isn't it? That I really regret I never told Brian about the book because I know he'd absolutely love it. So my mum, I got to show it to her, and that she can't see the finished product, but
She knew that
she
it
got
was.
to she got the manuscript. So yeah,
Yeah, no, that's an amazing thing to do, and I mean, I always say that I know people think differently about people that you've lost. About I like to think that they know anyway what you're done, what you've done. So somewhere out there, they're in the ether, they're floating around, still part of everything. What's interesting when you were describing the whole the sort of format of the book, it does lend itself very much to something that you're very professional at, which is documentary. So, did you make a documentary as you were doing it, or is that something you consider doing now, or is that already in the can?
all the way through, I was thinking, and like cast the actors already in my mind. That I think it does lend itself very well to a documentary, and so I did film. I visited all the locations. There's quite a few different houses that she lived in and places that were connected to the story that I visited in person, and I videoed all of that. And I will release some of that online at some point.
Yeah,
For example, the house where she grew up in Liverpool, where the captain and his family, it's like her childhood home. The lady there was happy to show me around, and you can kind of see these tangible connections with her childhood. This is where she learned to walk and talk and form her first friendships and what have you. So it's quite a powerful location. And so I have documented all of that. I do think it does lend itself very well to a documentary. I know there's a woman at the moment who is already writing a dramatized version of it, a what are they called? It's not a fiction novel, but you know what I mean, like a fiction novel based on history.
yeah.
And I found that curious. She was already on it before I even finished the book. I think that will definitely lend itself to the film genre.
Yeah, yeah. No, a screenplay of that would be just amazing, wouldn't it? I mean, it would be completely absorbing because the other thing is you've got an inbuilt following already because even I mean, I would never have done obviously the detective work that you've done, and you are obviously a super fan. But I think so many people, because it was such a massive part of history, are fascinated by it. You know, even in a very sort of minimal way, in a passing way. You know, as soon as you mention the Titanic, everyone's got a story that they've heard, whether it's one of the true ones or one of the ones that's just you know, a lot of it is hearsay and as Chinese whispered its way through the decades now. But yeah, everyone feels that it's a part of them. And it was 1912, wasn't it, when it went down? So to have such an amazing story come to the fore that's actually not even just that, it's made it even well, you would think you couldn't make the Titanic story even more interesting and better, but it kind of does, doesn't it? Because it's like this person that was just an afterthought in the description of the captain. Oh, and by the way, he had a daughter, end of. Actually, you've gone to the trouble of going, actually, let's see what happened to her. And it's an incredible story. You know, it is the stuff of movies. It is Agatha Christie. It is all of those you know, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, all of those genres in one fantastic story that is also wrapped up in the other of the century's most fantastic stories, the sinking of the Titanic. So it's really incredible.
You've hit on something quite important there because it's got both positives and negatives. The name Titanic sells. You know, you put Titanic on anything, on a documentary, it sells. But the problem with that, I think, is that everyone thinks they know the story, and there are also those with very sort of commercial minds who've released books and documentaries that are, you know, full of holes. So there is a lot of misinformation out there. And one of the things that the book does is not just about the spy and the daughter, you know, the first part, the captain. It does actually explore what really happened to Captain Smith. Like, how did he really die? Was he to blame? I mean, a lot of people make assumptions. Most people think that one, you know, he ignored iceberg warnings, that he was about to retire, so it was his last voyage, that he was speeding and
That's the
just
one I've heard.
ignored it.
So out of those, that's the one that I feel I've heard the most is that he was retiring, and B, he was determined to do it in a sort of a record time to go out in a blaze of glory, basically, and hence mistakes were made.
Yeah, and that's all false. I mean, he was on the verge of retirement, but it wasn't necessarily his last voyage. There was no date set. Obviously it became his last voyage, but there was no, there was no date set, so it wasn't supposed to be his last voyage. In fact, the evidence suggests that he probably would have waited. The Titanic was one of three sisters, and he probably would have waited for the third one before retiring because he was very popular. You know, millionaires would rearrange their schedule so they could make sure that they were sailing with him as the captain because you know he was extremely popular. The things like the speeding, I mean, he absolutely not, and ignoring iceberg warnings, absolutely not. But I'll be honest, I for many years, I mean, I've been studying the Titanic since the late 80s, and I thought that I thought he was going to retire. I thought he was speeding, ignoring iceberg warnings. He was basically, you know, he was a bit past it. You know, he should have
Yeah, that's the
been in
impression
a,
you
you
get,
know,
isn't it?
but he
Yeah.
was he was 62. He wasn't exactly that old, and there's absolutely no evidence of issues with competency. In fact, quite the opposite. He was known as a disciplinarian. He was known as being a very competent captain. And what most people don't know, in fact, something I've brought out in the book, after the sinking, that 14 captains, and not just from one line, from rival companies, all stood up in a court of law and acknowledged that what he did was no different from what they would have done.
Oh wow, that's amazing.
So, you know, there has been this. I think it's a natural thing, and a lot of conspiracy theories are often rooted in this human desire to find someone to
A
pin the blame
reason.
on.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, to kind of find structure out of the chaos.
yeah.
So it was someone trying to do this, or you know, there's this villainous organization behind it. But in
Also, I
actual
think
fact, you know, it's not the case.
no, and also I think as well, it's the old insurance companies, isn't it? They probably needed someone to pin the badge of blame onto because then everyone coughs up and pays out. Whereas if it is like so random and there isn't any one person they can point a finger at, it means that they have to pay up, isn't it? You know, if they can say
Well,
it
you're
was
you're, you're
error.
absolutely right about that because the I mean, the British Board of Trade inquiry said that he wasn't to blame. That while the decisions that were made were not good decisions in hindsight, again, anyone in hindsight would
Yeah.
question what they
Who
did.
doesn't love
But
hindsight?
but like to your point about insurance, there was another court case a little bit later where it was essentially a compensation court case where a father had lost his son and he thought that the ticket conditions would stipulate some kind of compensation, and the only way that they could get compensation was by finding negligence, and hence that was the only time that negligence was really ever sort of settled in a court case. But when you actually look at the evidence, you realize that was for reasons of compensation. This wasn't maritime negligence.
No.
Now, there's a lot of accusations about, they didn't have binoculars, which is completely irrelevant. They didn't use binoculars, but, binoculars are used to identify, not to spot. So you see something and then you use them to see what that is. Things like this. So with Titanic, there was a lot of misinformation out there, and I hope that this book clears it up. I mean, it's quite incredible and heroic. I've discovered that Captain Smith, not only how he died, but while he was dying, he was trying to save the life of a child,
Oh my
a baby.
God. Oh.
And yeah, this was something that was at the time kind of thought, oh, it's just another story, a nice story. But the evidence now, and there's another author who's just released a book just before mine that also covers this to some degree, and he came to the same conclusion. We did this independently. Came to the same conclusion that he was involved in trying to save the life of a child, and I kind of think that resonates because as the ship was sinking, he was thinking of family because he had this daughter. She had just turned 14. She'd had her birthday about a week or so before, and you don't know what people are thinking at a moment like this, but I do think he must have been thinking about his wife and his family.
Of course,
and here he is trying to save a child. So and I've been able to get permission to print the photographs of the two possible children who he was trying to save from the family. So the book's got 130 images in it, which is
Wow.
I mean, I originally had over 270 images, but the publisher was like, "No, you're going to have to get that down to 100."
That's
And
a
I was able
tough
to
call,
sneak.
though, isn't it? That's a
I was
tough
able to
call.
sneak 30 in there, so that's 130. I was like, I hope they don't notice. They didn't
No.
seem to. So there were a lot of documents, a lot of letters. You can see letters that the captain wrote,
It's
and
fascinating.
yeah, there's a lot in there.
Yeah, it's incredible. So, just before we continue, we're at the Zoom. Dear listener, you will know by now that I haven't got professional Zoom. So, Dan and I are going to take a little comfort break, as they say. Dan, what you're going to do? You're going to go a wee. You're going to get a drink. You're going to stay put.
Back after this commercial break.
Exactly. Remember, I've never remembered to do this. Like and subscribe. It sounds so cheesy, doesn't it? That's why I don't do it. But yeah, so we're going to have a quick break and be back with you. You wouldn't even notice. I don't even have to say this because I could edit this out, but I like to be honest. That's one of my main things.
Transparency. Yeah.
I'm a see-through. I'm just like a cellophane door. But is a door cellophane? No, it's not. It's a glass door. Joe, what are you talking about? Anyway, we will catch you again in 5 minutes or possibly 2. And actually, you won't even notice. Dear listeners, see you soon. So we were talking about the captain and the various sort of Chinese whispers that surround why it happened and trying to point the blame. And going back to the reason you wrote the book in the first place, you've obviously been a huge fan since, did you say since the 80s?
Yes, I was, well, going back to what we were mentioning earlier about living in Australia. I was living in Australia, Brisbane, and I remember watching this film called SOS Titanic. It's like a 70s kind of film. And I remember my parents saying, this is quite amazing. A ship sinks on its maiden voyage. And I just couldn't wait to see it sink. But it spent all this time on those love stories. And I remember as a kid sitting there thinking,
Just sink the boat.
when does it sink? In all honesty, it was quite disappointing when it finally did. You didn't really see anything. And that was my first awareness of seeing the ship. And then not very long after, like weeks after, I was in a bookshop and I saw this book where you could actually build a model of the Titanic, and it wasn't a small. It's like 1.5 meters.
Wow.
And it was, at that moment we were moving back from Australia to New Zealand, and I was losing all my friends I'd formed in Australia, and I kind of needed an escape. It's not too dissimilar to the writing of the book, I guess. And I needed this escape, so this was it. So I ended up building this ship, and it was quite clever because the book, as you built it, it would tell you about what happened in that part of the ship, and different stories and all that. So it was a way of introducing history. I didn't know this at the time, but I look back in hindsight and think it's a very good way of introducing history to young people.
It really is. I was just thinking exactly
As you're
that. Yeah.
building this, you're like,
Yeah.
wow,
And
this
this
is
is
what
what
actually
happened in the
happened.
hull, and this is what, yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so by the time I'd finished, I was then in this new classroom in New Zealand. It was a kind of a good way of re-establishing myself, and before I knew it, I was giving this presentation to the class all about the Titanic. Teacher said, "Oh, that was so good. Would you go and do it at the Rotary Club as well?" And I was like, "Yeah, okay." And before
Oh,
you know it, I was, in fact, long story short, within a year or so, I was known as Mr. Titanic. And I'm like 14 years old
that's
in
amazing.
the
I love it.
area, going to classrooms at the schools and things and giving little tours and things. So yeah, and that's when the obsession. And this is where I've got this very acute sense of imposter syndrome at the moment, because I've spent like 30 years collecting books about the Titanic, reading books, sometimes occasionally meeting these authors and getting them to sign books and things like that. And
Now
suddenly
you're
now,
one.
yeah, and I've had one of these authors just write to me and says, welcome to the club kind of thing. I don't know, I don't think there is a club, but
Well, there
and I'm
should
like,
be.
well, maybe, but I'm like, yeah, I mean, I look at the book and I see my name on it. And I'm like, well, that looks like a really interesting book, but why is my name on it? So it's a very curious thing, and
It's surreal, I suppose.
and I'm the other thing, and I know because you're a published author, you must have experienced this as well. When you receive the book, you've got this tangible thing in your hand, and you're looking through it. There's also this morbid fear that you're going to find a typo.
Oh, yes. But
So, I really want. Oh, this is really interesting, but I can't read it because if I find some typo, then I'm going to never forgive myself.
do you know what made me feel better about that is I don't know if you do you know Susie Dent? She's a lexicographer. She used to be on Countdown. I think she still is on Countdown. She's in the dictionary corner. So she's written many, many, many books about language and where words come from, etymology, I think it's called, isn't it? Something like that. And she published a book, I think about 2 years ago, and the title was Word Perfect. And she was devastated because there were mistakes in it. So it always makes me feel a lot better. I'm like, if someone at her stage, supported by a big, massive publishing house, can produce something that goes out a bit wrong. But it's human, isn't it? It doesn't matter.
Well, yeah, that's right. And in fact, the author he's written the foreword for my book, he's written what is the definitive biography of Captain Smith. He pointed out that one of his chapter headings has got a typo in it.
Well, there you go.
And it kind of makes you feel better because he's really on it. He's really really a clever man. You're right. We're all human. Yeah, but it is exciting. I mean, I never set out to write a book. This isn't. In fact, just briefly, that side of it is that when I discovered the information that there was, that Captain Smith's family was, had an MI5 spy and all this, I thought it was going to be an article. I just wrote a short piece, thinking, I'll publish this in a magazine or online or somewhere. I've got a couple of Titanic websites. I'll put it on that website, and then as I started writing it, I just realized this is going to be a very long article, and there's more to go. And I was like, there's more interesting things. I haven't finished researching this, and it was actually Gary Cooper who wrote the foreword for my book, who said to me, in fact, one of the great things about writing this book is the people I've met and friendships I've made with incredibly talented people like Gary. He just said to me, Dan, you got to write a book. And I was like, oh, really? That wasn't the plan. It's kind of just happened, and I think that's good because it's more of a natural kind of fluid way of writing. I've not set out to be a Titanic author. I collect Titanic books. I don't write them.
No, you sort of
But
by accident you've done it. And I suppose as well what that does give you is the luxury of doing it in your own time without being under pressure of having an advance to do it.
I kind of felt, and I still feel it even now, that someone else is going to find out. There's this MI5 spy thing, and I have expected a knock at the door and two guys in black suits saying, MI5.
Yeah.
But I have felt that kind of. In fact, I've just discovered literally last week that I think it's the National Archives have got an MI5 exhibition that they've just launched. I was like, well, I didn't know about that because it could be
Yeah.
information for my book, so it could be a sequel. There was a bit of pressure, but I think that the positive is that when you've collected, and I've got probably 100 or something Titanic books, is that I know what works and what doesn't work, and I know so I've written the book the way because I use books to research things, and like things that annoy you. Like I've read books that don't have an index, and you're trying to find something. It's like there's no index, or that they don't reference things correctly. They'll just say this one book said something. You're like, well, which book? How
Who
can I
by?
research
Yeah.
that? So, for example, my book has 1,000. I think it's although the editor has taken it down slightly, but there's about 1,000 endnote references. So
Yeah.
everything's referenced. I wouldn't quote it unless it's fully referenced. Someone else could look it up and double check it. So I have written it for that geeky guy like
Yeah, it's
me.
very niche though, isn't it? So, and those sorts of people that I imagine are Titanic, like super fans.
Titanic X, they call them.
Titanic, what? Sorry,
Titanic X, Titanic X. Yeah, something like that.
Titaniacs, like
Yeah,
Titaniacs.
yeah.
I'm a
I don't like
Titaniac.
that term. I don't like
That
that
sound,
term
sounds like you're
personally.
sort of made of made of some sort of
That sounds like
metal.
maniac, doesn't
Oh
it?
yeah,
Titanic
a
maniac. Titaniac.
Titaniac, a
Yeah,
Titaniac. Yeah.
yeah.
Yes, yes. Anyway, but you would expect a Titaniac to absolutely devour any new information, books or anything that's published, and expect there to be sort of references that they can check and look up, because it is sort of, I suppose, on the geeky side of storytelling, isn't it? Because there's so
Well, it's
many
very much on the geeky side. I mean, my
different.
wife's like, this is very geeky. Although to me, the sort of the litmus test in a way was she doesn't have any interest at all in the Titanic at all. But when the book arrived, she was literally, other than myself, the first one to see it, and she picked it up and she said, I want to read this. And I thought actually that's passed the test. If someone who's not interested in the subject just looks at the book, I mean, obviously there is a slight what's the word?
Bias.
She's married. Yeah, bias. That's the word. She's married to me. She's got to say it. But no, but she's very honest, and
Yes.
she'll tell me, up front that she's not interested in the subject. But she said, well, that book does actually look really quite interesting. So
Yeah.
I felt that was the test, I guess.
Yeah,
But we'll
and to
see how
be
it goes.
honest, for me as well, it was exactly the same, because I'm not a Titaniac, but I do love if there's a documentary about the raising of it. I've watched all of those, and I've watched most, I would say, of the films that have been made about it. So it is one of those things that I think, as a writer and a performer, and it's just such an interesting sort of timeless, almost endless story, because it is still down there. People are still talking about it. So although it happened in 1912, it sort of resurfaces, so to speak, every year at least, with some either new discovery or some new take on what happened. Whether it was I mean, I've seen the documentaries where it was the rivets in the hull were not done properly, or were.
False.
Yes. Is that false as well? Have you looked into that
Yeah.
one? Ah,
Yeah.
nice. Perhaps we should start, Dan, a Titanic
Debunking.
quiz.
Yeah. But one of the things, well, I mean, going back to what you're saying about how there's just so many documentaries and what have you, is the very last sort of connected, an author named Pat Lacey. She was the very end of the line. She's like the great grand niece or something like that of the captain. And she was interviewed, I think it was 2012, which it was 100 years since the sinking, and she was asked like, why are there always another film, another documentary, and she said, it just doesn't sink. I thought that was quite a good way of summarizing it. In a way, the ship
It
just keeps
is. Do you
sinking.
know what? And that's just put my literally tingles down my spine, because I mean, they called it, when it was built, it was called unsinkable. But what if it was unsinkable for a different reason? So it's been
Well,
unsinkable
it
because
is
the story
unsinkable.
is, and yeah,
Well, that's another myth as well. The unsinkable
right.
Titanic.
Okay.
It's another. I mean, it's not quite a myth, but in the sense that it wasn't the only ship that was unsinkable at the time. That term was being used for all ships being built for the last 10 years. So
Yeah.
from around 1900 to 1912. Oh no, I'm getting geeky here.
No, no, go.
But it's the idea that the Titanic and there was some kind of arrogance because we're unsinkable is nonsense, because actually all of the ships being, the Mauritania, Lusitania, all the contemporary ships of the time, the modern shipbuilding techniques, they had these watertight compartments. It was considered that most ships of that time, modern ships, wouldn't sink.
Right.
And so it wasn't unique to the Titanic. It's only became unique in the irony afterwards
Yeah.
that it did sink. but then any other ship, the Lusitania, Mauretania, all these other ships, they were also designed the same way. So it wasn't unique to. So there's a lot about the Titanic which is taken out of context, and when sometimes the truth is a little bit more boring than what people want, because it's obviously more interesting to think that it was Captain Smith's retirement voyage on a
Yeah.
ship that's been proclaimed unsinkable, and he goes too fast, but actually none of that's true.
No, it's so interesting. What I was going to refer to back was that when I saw on Facebook, because we're Facebook friends, when I saw on Facebook that out of nowhere you were like, I've written this book and it's out, and it's out on the 15th of February, guys, listeners. You can buy it everywhere, I presume. Then on Amazon, you can probably pre-order it.
Yeah,
Can you on Amazon
W.H.
now?
Smith,
Yeah.
Waterstones, yeah, all the main
Amazing,
places. Yeah.
amazing. But as soon as I saw your post, I was completely the same as your wife, as in saying to myself, right, I need to have a copy of that. I need to read that because I'm an avid reader anyway. And the story of the Titanic has been in my part of my life, like it has everybody's, because of the nature of the story and the huge disaster that it was. The fact that it looked to be a very different take on it. So I can totally see why you had publishers fighting you for it.
Well, it's very rare to find new information. I mean,
Yes.
they've kind of explored every single angle possible,
Mm.
and there's always a new book coming out that kind of rehashes what we already know.
Yep.
Maybe just kind of reframes it in a slightly different way, but it's not new information. So I felt this was a unique opportunity to, for example, in the book, there are unpublished letters that you can read for the very first time. Captain Smith writing to family, his widow writing just after he died. There's things like that which haven't been published, and
No.
and certainly photographs that I discovered. I mean, I one of the thrills I found was finding the wedding photograph of the captain's daughter marrying
The
this
spy.
MI5 spy. I never thought I would find that. I thought that wouldn't. But I was just happened to be scouring through a Liverpool newspaper at the time, and they just happened to print this little picture of their wedding photograph. Because the interesting thing that happened, without getting sidetracked, is that I found that after he died, his image would be like removed from photographs. Like I found a photograph of the captain's daughter Mel. It's a nice photograph of her with some sort of posing with some children at I think it's a birthday party. There's a cut. You can't see who else she's with, and it's actually her husband was cut out of the photograph by somebody in the family. I don't know who. So there was all these. So I never thought I would ever find that wedding photograph of the two together, because there seems to be some kind of sensitivity. Perhaps some may have thought it was suicidal. I don't know the reasons, but those
That's
discoveries. I
intriguing,
mean,
though, isn't it?
that's the thrill of the research. It's quite addictive. You start discovering these things, like finding her with her plane. I found a photograph of Captain Smith and his wife together. Again, we've never seen before, because normally it's either the captain. There's loads of photos of him in his uniform on ships, obviously.
Yeah, that's the
But
one
what
we're
about him
all.
at home? What does he look like in his normal clothing
Pipe
with
and
his wife?
slippers. Yes. What was he? What
And
was
I
he
found
doing?
I found one. I couldn't believe I found it. And I think one of the things I'm giving a presentation later this month is the amazing resources that we have at our fingertips, and the archives, the museums, the libraries. It's incredible. And I've going to the British Library and just getting lost in the newspapers there. It's a fantastic experience that you're uncovering history, and suddenly you're fleshing out this kind of two-dimensional character into 3D, and
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
I'm addicted to that.
And I think it's particularly pertinent and interesting at the moment as well, because so many times women sort of get the treatment that Mel got, which is basically you're a footnote in history, when actually your story is as interesting or more interesting than the footnote that you're part of. But nobody bothers. Oh, it was just the woman. It was just his daughter or his wife. Who gives a shit, about them? And it's just interesting that you spotted that and thought, well, hang on, wait a minute. Let's see what the effect of that was on these women, the wife and the daughter. And then, so often the female side of those stories is glossed over. Wife becomes widow, daughter has lost her father, end of story. But there's never really an end of that story. The fact that when you bothered to take the time to go, well, let's just see how they coped after this, and it's been a treasure trove of intrigue and deception and love affairs, and it's like it's the stuff of life, and it feels like you've brought her to. I feel like I think, as a writer, you get to know your characters and you feel like you've lived with them, and I'm sure you must feel the same. Like you must, because you've immersed yourself in these people's lives for the writing of this book, and they must seem very real to you even though they're long gone, which I think is a beautiful thing.
Oh, it's very surreal because there's a cemetery, Brookwood Cemetery, that where the captain's daughter's buried, along with the spy, and her mother, and also the MI5 director. And when I visited, it's funny. I actually left my visit to the end part when I almost finished writing the book. I left it to the end, and when I visited that cemetery, I just suddenly realized this is my book all laid out here. All these people here.
So they're all in
This
the same cemetery.
family plot, yes, this is another. You could get me sidetracked onto this because there's another interesting thing is that it seems like the memorials to Captain Smith and to everyone that they're all wrong. They're all like the wrong addresses and wrong locations and for example in the cemetery, right? It's a fascinating family plot where you've got the captain's widow and their daughter, but there's no signage. There's signage pointing out lots of different all these other famous people, but it doesn't point out that family plot. It's almost like, if I'm not a conspiracy-minded person, I like to get the facts, right?
Yeah.
But it's like, why? Why? But for me, just standing there, I did feel this huge sort of like responsibility, I guess, to tell the story correctly. To finally, it's because it's kind of interesting because the captain's widow, Eleanor, her name is, her grave actually does say widow of the captain of the Titanic.
Right.
But then Mal's grave, she's buried with her husband. It just says Mal. It doesn't even put the dates of her birth and death, which you normally have. And so anyone walking past, they might clock the fact that there's someone, connected to the Titanic buried there, but you don't
Who's
know her
that woman?
story.
No.
And so I did feel this responsibility. I'm telling her story. In fact, I've always wanted, and maybe I'll regret it, that I didn't tell it completely as her story. But I felt that I would then end up dramatizing it too much because there is still a lot I don't know about
Yeah,
her.
I get you. Yeah.
And so I didn't want to overly dramatize it, which I've left it to this lady who's now dramatizing it. It does make you feel responsible. And I do feel like I have come to know her. I mean, I found this, going back to it, talking about films and what have you, I found this letter where she actually gives her opinion of because obviously Captain Smith has been portrayed in films, like literally months after the sinking. One of the first films that comes out is a German film called In Night and Ice. He's portrayed in that, and the beard and the uniform and all that, and that was the beginning. And like now, everyone, George C. Scott, Bernard Hill, there's been lots of people performing Captain Smith, and I've always wondered, but what did she think? The daughter actually knew him. What did she think of it? And I found this letter where she talks about one of the portrayals being infuriating, and she gives a good reason why. So it's kind of, in a way, I like flashing those things, those her opinion and thoughts coming out,
Yeah.
what she really, really thinks. And actually, at the end of the book, I reveal how incredibly generous she was as well as a person, because she was an art collector. She collected a lot of paintings, but also furniture. She basically gave that all away to a couple, to someone who'd become almost like an adoptive daughter to her. Just gave it away to them and changed their life forever, because he ended up becoming quite an important person at Christie's.
Oh, right.
The
Wow.
auction house.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's this like her legacy continues. She's her generosity wasn't just limited to
Yeah.
years before. It's still tangible. So I kind of I do feel a responsibility as a writer to tell that story, and I hope I have. And there were a lot of photographs of her in the book. I've discovered as many as I possibly could, right up into her old age. So I do think that the story's there. But she is almost like a narrator. She's almost like Rose in the Titanic film. Like
right,
that sort of bookends the beginning and the end. And I almost think that would be a quite logical storytelling device if you ever were to dramatize it, because she's there at the beginning and she's there at the end and she tells the story. But in a way, she's almost like a participant. It's not about her. She was just there observing and part of it, but it's not about her. But in a way, that's the way she would like it. you know. As a book, I don't feel like it's a book just about her. It's about her experiences, I guess.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And I think, as you said at the beginning, you know, it is her sort of voice narrating this version story of the Titanic and things that went on around at that time and in her life after the death of her father. I personally can't wait to read it. And I mean, seriously, as if you needed to sell it anyway, you didn't. I was always going to read it. But I mean, just having this chat has been phenomenal. I just do think it's such an interesting take on a story that's been in circulation for such a long time, and that it's long overdue, and it's long overdue in a female voice as well. I think that's what sets this apart, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that you uncovered not only lots of new stories that are related to the Titanic, but that the voice that it's done in is female. This is very much about this woman's extraordinary life. I mean, she rose above a tragic situation and made the best of life after losing almost everyone in her life, which is
inspirational, isn't it?
Yes, exactly right. And is a testament to all of us, like we started with this, that you know recently sadly lost your mum and a close friend, and it is what life is about, you know, and it is how you deal with those losses. And I think what you've done is a testament to your friend and to your mum, and I think it's going to be a huge success. And I just know that there's going to be either a film at the cinema or on Netflix or Apple TV. And can I come to the premiere? No, I was kidding, obviously. But no, I do think I wasn't kidding. I was kidding about the invite, not kidding about the fact that I think it'll be a film. I'm certain that someone will snap that up, because it's just such a beautiful new slant on a very old tale, really.
It's funny because another podcast I just recorded recently, the very first question was who have you cast in the different roles, which was, you know, it really kind of blindsided me, because I've not really, you know, I don't see my book as a film particularly, although I know the potential there is huge. But yeah, it is interesting to think of it that way. But at the moment, my focus is on hoping that people enjoy the book, and you know that it's inspiring, is like we're going back to saying earlier. But also, you know, it maybe busts a few myths and sort of educational, and a good read. I mean, one of the things, you know, with 130 images in it, I did try to make it a good read. I mean, I am very aware. I see the comments online with people saying how, you know, that they tried reading this book, but it was just too hard. You know, it's just a bit too tough, because it you know, it's a long. It's 416 pages. My book. There are times when it gets quite legal, because there are some court cases and things like that. So it is tough. So I've tried to make it as interesting. And I think as a filmmaker, I guess I'm a visual storyteller.
Of course,
so
yeah.
I had to put as many photographs in there as possible. Just not 274.
You're still bitter about that, I can tell.
I am actually. Well, no, the
You'll
thing
have to
that's
do another
interesting.
version that's like just a compendium of the photography from that book.
Yeah, I think there's just so many interesting images to share, and but is that there's been quite a few, and I'm hugely grateful to a few individuals who've checked it for me, you know, proofread it, and
Yes.
and their feedback. Well, all these pictures are amazing, Dan. Where did you find them? And I've kind of had to tell them, you know,
It's not
well,
in
actually,
it. Yeah.
over half of them are now gone, you know, but that's just the way publishing works. I mean, my original word count was 153,000 words.
Wow.
And the first publisher who said yes, and I thought I would honour that, the fact that they were the first one to say yes, I gave it to them. But they came back and said, well, it's got to be 100,000. And I'm like, how do I lose a third of the story? I'm going to have to take out one of the characters, basically.
Yeah.
So, but then one of the other publishers said, well, no, we could do 140,000. And so that's what it is. But and again, I never, as I say, I wrote this as an article. It started off. I thought this was a short book.
Did you? I don't think so.
Well, no, honestly, when I was writing it, when I look at my manuscript online, it's quite. I think it's a short manuscript. I don't think it's a particularly long one, but I guess with all the photographs, it's 416 pages and 1,000 endnotes. But hopefully, it's not boring. It is. No. I do think it's an interesting story, but I have tried to tell it fully, like not skip over anything or. It is the sort of full version for the geeky Titanic researcher. So it is geeky.
Well, on the geeky note, we should wrap it up. It's been so, I mean, beyond interesting talking about all things Titanic, and at the start we're talking about your director of photography stuff as well. Well, that's the thing. If they made a film, would you do the DOP and direct it as well?
Oh, I'd absolutely love to, but
Of
it never works that way. I was once involved in another project where, I was quite heavily involved, but then it got handed off to someone in
somewhere else.
Discovery, yeah, Discovery Channel, and disappears. But
No.
that's it's the nature of it. But yeah, absolutely, it does deserve a telling. So
Yes. Yeah, yeah,
I'd be
yeah.
thrilled for it.
Oh, amazing. If you're free and we can swing it, I would love if I did some interviews for the Folkestone Book Festival, as I mentioned, in October. It runs for 2 weeks. If you're around and free, I'd love to interview you on stage there as part of that if you fancy it. But have a think and we'll sort out
Oh, I
dates
like
and
the
see if
idea of a
it's
festival.
yeah,
That
so it's a
sounds
book
really good.
it's a book festival that happens every year
Mm.
here, and yeah, so it's 2 weeks of really interesting new authors and books and live hour long discussions with an audience. It's in a theatre. It's in our lovely theatre called the Quarter House. So yeah, so that would be amazing. So I'll see what I can do this end, and if you're
Yeah,
free
I'm up for
and
that.
they've got a space, that would be absolutely wonderful.
I am more of a behind the camera person, so this side of it, even just having my voice being recorded, is
Yeah.
kind of
Well, it'll only be
scary,
me. It'll be
intimidating.
little
But yeah,
me, so you
but
won't be
you are
scared.
great. You're
Yeah.
you're you're a very good interviewer, Joe.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So hopefully, maybe, you never know, just putting it out there in the universe, that might happen, in which case I'll see you in October.
sounds good.
But I also might see you're doing, let's just go through a few things before it runs out of time again. The book is released on the 15th of February. Brilliant Valentine's gift to everyone. Quite
Well, you
romantic,
can
spice.
pre-order it via my website with signed copies, but I don't think my signature's worth anything. But if you're wanting a signed numbered version, because people have been asking for it, and
Yes, I want one
I
of
I know
those.
I've asked it for other authors, so I
Yes.
do get it, but
Well, I
it
want
does seem
one,
a bit
Dan,
odd.
so I'm going to
Yeah,
do that. So, what's your website that we can order those off of?
at titanicofficers.com. And yeah, actually today, there will be an advert going on the front page. That's all you need to know is titanicofficers.com.
Titanicoffices.com. So what I'll do is I'll put that link in the blurb of the show. So if anyone's listening and doesn't get it as we're speaking, that will be in the blurb for the show. And all your other work we can find at is it Dan the cameraman? Your all your
That's
wonderful
my
photography.
DOP
Yeah.
website, and then like as an editor production company, there's parksproductions.com.
Parksproductions.com. So check Dan out there, buy his wonderful book, leave reviews if you read it. I can't wait to get my signed copy, Dan. And yeah, thanks for being amazing and for letting me spend the morning chatting to you about all things Titanic. The book is called Titanic Legacy, The Captain, the Daughter, and the Spy. Thanks very much, Dan.
You're welcome. It's been great.
Oh, you've been amazing. Thanks so much and see you soon. Thanks for listening to Real Folk with me, Jo Burke.